Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. And we have a horribly limited amount of time, or at least so it seems to us, because journalists like to go on and on. So we're going to try to move very quickly. I want to say at the outset, the question procedure is as follows. If, starting right now, a question occurs to you, raise your hand. At the moment at which the question occurs to you, someone will rush over and get it in written form, and then at about 11, it'll come up, the questions will come up here, and I'll start reading the questions out to the panelists. I believe I read them out without the questioner's name attached, so let that be in your thinking as you decide on formulating questions. I want to start by introducing Richard Sambrook, who's going to show a short film clip. And just the only thing I'll say as introduction to his film clip is we as journalists are in a paradoxical position here, and we're going to explore some of these paradoxes. The paradox is roughly this. Everybody in the university, starting very much with Lee, is increasingly interested in globalization. And that's essentially why this event is taking place. Our dream is that the university can be a truly international institution, and that the work of the university is truly international in its nature. And certainly our school, and I think every other person on this stage today would say that his or her school is becoming more international in every possible way. Now, the paradox is journalists who occupy the key role of sort of intermediary between people in power, people with ideas, conflict, all the things going on in the world that aren't ready at your fingertips, and the general public, we should be the most globalized. If what we are is information purveyors, the information we purvey should be a kind of common carrier that lays down a basis of facts and analysis that everyone can agree on, and then they can have the debate. But, ...
Okay, Nick, thanks very much. To get the discussion going, I asked the BBC's monitoring department to take one day's news and international story and compare and contrast how some different channels around the world reported it. And the day, I think, was September the 10th, the day that General Petraeus made his report on the state of affairs in Iraq. And as you'll see, as we compare and contrast the way that report was covered by a range of different global channels from the US to Europe to the Middle East, there's some interesting differences that emerge that perhaps we can then move on to talk about. So perhaps you could play the tape.
Petraeus, the top American commander in Iraq, recommended cutting US troops in the country by about 30,000 by the summer of next year. The general told a joint hearing of the House of Representatives, Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committees in Washington that the security situation was improving. In his view, America's current surge of troops was meeting its military objectives. International TV news channels each had their own angle on the story. BBC World's lunchtime bulletin reported that an opinion poll carried out by the BBC found that the majority of Iraqis disagreed with the US general's views. They did not believe security had improved.
Nearly a quarter of Iraqis now say things are very bad compared to 1 in 10 2 years ago. 2/3 disapprove of the way the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is handling his job. 70% say that the US troop surge has made security worse. 68% say there has been forcible separation of Sunni and Shias in areas where they used to live together.
Reporting live from Baghdad, BBC World correspondent Lise Doucet said the government there welcomed the report.
Yes, indeed. We had the first official reaction in the government statement read by the National Security Advisor, Muwafiq al-Rabai. He welcomed the reports made by both General David Petraeus and also Ambassador Ryan Crocker. And he didn't actually comment directly on General Petraeus' comment that by the summer they could return to what they call pre-surge levels. That means 30,000 American troops leaving by next summer. But the National Security Advisor did say that he could see that in the near future, as he put it, that Iraqi forces would be able to carry out combat operations without calling on the coalition forces.
The Iraqi state television Al Iraqiyya carried the US general's testimony live. It featured as the third item in its flagship evening news bulletin. The channel highlighted the general's views that the Iraqi armed forces were performing better. It also interviewed an Iraqi government spokesman who said the report was positive and reflected the real situation in Iraq. It dispelled the idea of a civil war, the spokesman said. Most Pan-Arab TV channels had live coverage of General Petraeus in Washington. Al Jazeera, the most watched of the Pan-Arab stations, devoted several of its talk shows to the story. It interviewed an exiled Israeli Arab pundit who accused the US of fueling sectarian differences in Iraq. Al Jazeera also ran vox pops with Iraqi refugees in Syria and Iraqis in the Kurdistan region. Saudi-owned Al Arabiya, broadcasting from Dubai, interviewed its own US affairs expert, who said some Democrat members of Congress disputed General Petraeus' credibility and independence. A guest on Al Arabiya's daily talk show, Sunni Iraqi leader Salih al-Mutlaq, said the report played down violence in Iraq.
Regrettably, this report does not match the size of daily sacrifices made by the Iraqi people. It does not match the amount of blood that is shed daily.
The US global TV news pioneer CNN led its bulletin with General Petraeus' remarks in Washington.
Tribal rejection of al-Qaeda that started in Anbar province and helped produce such significant change there has now spread to a number of other locations as well. Based on all this and on the further progress we believe we can achieve over the next few months, I believe that we will be able to reduce our forces to the pre-surge level of brigade combat teams by next summer without jeopardizing the security gains that we have fought so hard to achieve.
CNN followed up with a feature about a former Iraqi insurgent who had fought against the coalition forces before switching sides and now worked alongside American troops. Iran's Press TV, an English-language international news channel which launched in July this year, took the line that the US Congress rejected General Petraeus' report.
Well, the US House Foreign Affairs Committee has rejected the Iraq War report given by top US commander in Iraq, David Petraeus. Committee Chairman Tom Lantos said Petraeus and US Ambassador to Iraq Brian Crocker are only trying to convince Congress that Washington is winning the war in Iraq. However, Lantos said Congress isn't buying it because it knows that the situation in Iraq is critical now. Lantos said US troops should pull out of the country immediately.
France 24, a global news channel in French, English and Arabic, described the testimony as Judgment Day for President Bush. The channel highlighted US claims that Iran was seeking to further destabilize Iraq for its own interests. France 24 then focused on anti-US demonstrations in the Iraqi capital.
So, it's a little like the story of the blind men and the elephant. Richard, it seems to me that there's one set of questions about do you think the war in Iraq is a good idea or a bad idea? There's another set of questions, how's it going, that are sort of fact and analysis questions. And we really see a large degree of disagreement about that basic question. Is this a problem for the press globally? Is there any way to transcend the kind of perspectivalism that you see in this little tape?
Well, I think what's interesting about that, Nick, it's always interesting when you make those comparisons, and as somebody who leads a broadcast news operation, disconcerting as well. I'm sure all of those broadcasters could or would argue that their coverage was objective in the sense of being based on evidence or based on facts, but you can clearly see they all have a very different framework, a very different basis of the judgments they're making for the selection of what they highlight and what they emphasize. And the disconcerting part is that those judgments reinforce the kind of cultural position and indeed the political positions of a lot of the countries and cultures that they come from, absolutely including the BBC and CNN as well, to a greater degree than I think anybody would, any of them would admit without having that evidence laid out in front of them. So, I mean, I think that one of the challenges for us as we move into a global environment for journalism, and we're living in an unprecedented era for global journalism. There's almost a new global channel every month. We've got the internet and so on as well. Is the global conversation, can we establish a kind of solid foundation of fact, if you like, of how the war's going, from which you can then have an opinion about whether it's a good or a bad thing, or actually is even that foundation subject to cultural interpretations to a worrying degree?
So answer the question you just posed. What do you think? And
Well,
if it's the first, how do we do it?
I think we need a solid foundation, and we have to continue to work at it, and I think it's probably a lot more difficult than many of us are prepared to recognize.
Let me turn to you next, Ipek. Tell us a little about how the Iraq War is playing in Turkey, and in particular, how to the country and to you personally as a broadcast journalist, the rise of Al Jazeera has changed life.
I think we have to look back and go back to 2003 when the first U.S. operation was being planned, and there was the sense in the U.S. administration that the Turkish parliament was going to give a go-ahead for using its soil for the operation, and a lot of the plans were made accordingly. And then the public opinion was completely against this, and it didn't pass in parliament. And I would say that in general, in Turkey, we feel that this is an aggression towards the Iraqi people, that it could have been handled better, and we see now no end to the conflict, which is in sight. And the other thing, it was mentioned in the news, the sectarian violence we are very much worried about. So I would say that though as Turks we increasingly use the internet, so our source of information is not necessarily local channels. We increasingly use global networks. We have subsidiaries of global networks like CNN. A lot of people get BBC and now Al Jazeera. This is shaping the Turkish discussion on the matter, but I would say most of the Turks, they rely on local channels for their source of information. It's mostly the intelligentsia and the newspapers that follow the global networks, and through them the information gets disseminated.
So if you were to watch this day just in the panoply of Turkish broadcast media, including Al Jazeera, since it's available there, what would you most likely have seen? As wide a range as this?
You would see the objective reporting about his testimony. That would be, he said X, Y, Z, but probably more closer to Al Jazeera, I would think.
By the way, as yet another one of these new interesting issues, we have a recent alum, one of my students who works for Al Arabiya, who told me that they've been told that they cannot go beyond saying there was death due to sectarian violence on the air. They cannot say who killed whom in the particular incident because of a fear that there'll be revenge killings motivated by that. So she feels like all the things we taught her at Columbia Journalism School she can't put into play, because if she does, it will cause people to be killed. Another set of paradoxes. Mike, you're currently running the International Herald Tribune, which of all the folks in the media should be immune to this. It's forgive me, a pretty elite and publication with a pretty global perspective, or at least a Western European perspective. Do you have to worry about this, or can you sit down in your news meeting and say, okay, let's all agree on how things are going in Iraq?
This is our daily challenge. We have to worry about this every day. We as journalists face a whole set of challenges in the world, the way it's changing now: technological challenge, business challenges, physical challenge to our own safety in many parts of the world. But the challenge of rising above our own paradigms, of being bigger than our own biases, is I think, the essential journalist challenge, always has been and probably always will be, but it has become more and more pressing, I think, in the world we now live in, and it is more and more our obligation to our own audiences. In many ways, I have life easier than most newspaper editors and television broadcasters around the world, because I at least have an audience all over the world, and I can't pander and cater to any one national perspective or I lose. The bigger challenge is if you're a national publication or a local publication anywheres on earth, the obligation you have to your audience to portray the world the way it really is and not just the way your audience believes it to be is our essential journalistic obligation. But it is a very difficult job, not just because we have our own preconceptions, but also because to bring your audience along and to have them hear things from you that don't fit their preconceived notions runs the risk that you'll make them angry, or even worse than making them angry, that you'll just lose their attention. And that's the worst thing that can happen to a journalist, is to lose your audience's attention. So you face a very big challenge as you try to bring your audience along to understand the world isn't exactly the way you thought it was before you opened my newspaper or turned on your television set, is our essential challenge, and a task I don't think we spend nearly enough time thinking about how to do.
So just to press on it, I mean, we're, as journalists always are, very good at posing questions and less good about answering them, but how do you solve that problem over the next generation as opposed to you tomorrow in putting out the paper?
One of the things we do at the Herald Tribune, which I think is very helpful to us, and perhaps there are versions of this that can apply, is we try to get as many different people with different perspectives in the process as we can. Our very wonderful French political reporter, Catherine Benhold, is German. Our very excellent Berlin correspondent, Judy Dempsey, is Irish. And we try to push as much as possible to have different points of view at the table or on the phone, and force ourselves to think differently, and force the Americans to think about the Eastern European point of view, and force our correspondent in Istanbul to think about Mr. Sarkozy's point of view, and make them look at these issues. You're never going to be perfect, but you can make it better.
Do you find yourself ever thinking, gee, when I was in Washington, for example, I really was wearing blinders and I just didn't have a broad enough perspective? And if that's true, if you could give a couple of examples of issues that you just see differently being here and supervising a more international staff.
Every single day. You see the world very differently once you get outside the United States, and I suspect you see it differently every time you get out of France or Turkey or anywhere else. Possibly not the United Kingdom.
Oh, no, definitely.
But I'll give you one very current example, which is essentially another way of looking at what Richard shared with us, which is, and I've just come back from New York, where I spent time at the New York Times, visited our Washington bureau. The Iraq War, just in terms of how important it is, looks different from outside the United States. You know, in the United States, it is the all-consuming issue. It's the major political event. It's the thing that everyone in the United States worries about. That is not true in the rest of the world. It's an important story. People in the rest of the world are worried about it. They wonder what it will mean about America's place in the world. Some are rooting for it to mean one thing, and some are praying it doesn't mean that thing. But the footprint that the Iraq War takes up in the United States is far larger, just to start with, than it is anywhere else on Earth, except possibly Iraq itself. And that by itself is an important journalistic point and changes the perspective. And it is an important issue for us in terms of how much of our time and effort is devoted in the Herald Tribune to the war.
Let me move to, and we'll circle back to all these things. Obviously, the big thing happening in journalism is the advent of the internet as really well on its way to becoming the dominant means of news provision, I think. So let's all talk a little about how that changes our lives, and I'll start with you, Richard.
Well, it changes lives in a number of ways. I mean, firstly, it's a huge technological challenge for any news organization. There are questions of resources. There are questions of simply managing, you know, how do you get your journalism onto the internet? What kind of services should you be offering? And the basic technology challenges, it moves incredibly rapidly. We're now getting into mobiles and so on as well. So there's a huge resource and technology challenge. But the bigger challenge, I think, is if you like, the journalistic and cultural one, where you know your role as a news organisation is fundamentally altered, and you know, our role as gatekeepers, I believe, has gone now, and it's hanging on in one or two places. But fundamentally, I think the gatekeeper role has gone. Basic daily news is commoditized. You don't have to sit down at 6 o'clock and switch on the TV or the radio to know what's happened that day. It's all around you. It's on the internet. It's on your mobile phone. It's on screens at the bus stop. It's wherever. So what is the role of a news organization? It's no longer just saying this has happened today. It's about interpretation. It's about analysis and explanation. But it's also about facilitating and hosting a conversation. And as more people, you know, through technology, want to take part in that discussion of news and want to have their voice heard and have more of a stake in it, then the role of the news organisation is to say we'll host that conversation, and we'll provide a framework for that conversation according to our editorial values, which hopefully you will respect and get some value back in return.
So talk a little about how you're doing that, and what kind of audience you have on the web. What's the nature of the audience? What are the ground rules for hosting the conversation, and so on?
Okay, let me give you a couple of examples. I mean, I'm responsible for the international services of the BBC, the global services. We run a program called World Have Your Say, a daily program which goes out on the radio and also on the internet. It's like a phone-in show, but it's a global one. It also brings in blog comments on whatever topic they're discussing that day. And one of the things we've discovered, for example, is we also have regional versions of it. There's one called Africa Have Your Say, which is the only place where someone in Nigeria can speak to someone in Tanzania about AIDS. And they can't do it through their national media. They can't do it through any regional media, really. And you get conversations and comparisons going on across boundaries and across cultures simply because of the nature of the technology that wouldn't happen otherwise. So our role is to host that and provide the platform and provide some of the values around it. So another example of that issue, I suppose, is the dilemma about moderating comments on the website. And as most news organisations, I think we started off by pre-moderating comments. People would email in their views and we'd decide which ones to put up. Quickly became apparent that wasn't good enough for the users. They didn't want us making that judgment. So we've now gone to post-moderation, which means that the comments go up and we then read through and take out anything that we think is offensive or inappropriate according to a transparent and published set of guidelines. So, again, our role is shifting there. We're there to provide a platform for that discussion that goes on our own website, but we're no longer the people that can say, well, we think we'll allow you to say that bit or we'll allow you to say that bit. We have to allow the users to have their own conversation, but we can put some values on it and say, no, you're not allowed to be offensive, you're not allowed to be racist, in order to nurture the right kind of conversation.
Let me turn the matter back to you, Peck. So when you go to work every day, what's your job? What's your function in society? Are you an information provider? Are you really there just to get the highest ratings? We were discussing just beforehand how you're a second-generation journalist. How's your function in society generally in terms of your daily activities different from your father's function in society? If you could just talk about that a little.
I'd like to think that people come to journalists for a perspective in addition to objective news reporting. So what I think is lacking and what I try to provide is a sense of perspective, because we have observed kind of a news as commodity. Every day there's more and more news available through many different channels. The internet, the regular channels, bloggers, emails, you name it. And you want to look for credibility and reliability. But I think most of all, I'm always looking for perspective about historical background to put news in context. Because oftentimes people might know what the latest announcement was, but they might not have all the resources to put it in perspective. And I think when you're forming opinions, you need some perspective. So that's how I see my role.
Do you think that is a view of you shared by your audience, that people trust you and think if she said it, it must be true, essentially?
Well, this is what I'm aiming at, and I think you build credibility like that, but we cannot stop thinking about our audience. The audience is used to fast news. They want more scandalous, better, more groundbreaking news. So they do like, especially in Turkey, this sort of journalism. So you cannot always be so calm and report the news and give your opinion. But I'm under the belief that there has to be more sensibility in the journalism world in Turkey.
Give us an example of a recent story that would be a huge scandal story in Turkey that would build a big audience, and then if you could talk about how you react to the presumed charge you get from your bosses to devote more airtime to that and less to what we can all sit here in a panel discussion and say the press should be doing.
Well, just to give this is going to be just a recent example. There is, for example, when I came here, my network was very well aware that I was going to be interviewing President Bollinger. And what's very hot about this news is the recent development of the speech of President Ahmadinejad at Colombia. So as a network and as my audience, probably they are very, very interested for me to really dig into this almost in the whole time that I have with the president, whereas in my view, this is not the only thing that I wanted to cover.
Ask him about his hobbies and.
No, I did ask that question. No, we didn't get to the hobbies, I assure you. But basically, you have to balance, I think, this kind of enthusiasm for consuming hot news and what it really means.
I was. I want to go from that to talking about some of the economic and structural issues that underlie some of this discussion. I was telling Richard last night, I had an evening, I guess last week, where the Communications Subcommittee of the House of Lords came to the United States on a fact-finding mission, and they're going to issue some sort of report. And I was one of a group of people they took out to dinner. Which I was feeling really good about myself for having been invited until Richard told me, well, nobody pays attention to the House of Lords anymore. But up to that point, it was a very heady experience. At one point in the evening, I said to them, you know, it's arguable that the leading news organization in Britain is, in some sense, a government agency. I know you're not really a government agency and you have many firewalls and Chinese walls and other forms of protection, but nonetheless, there's the license fee that enables what I'm sure is the biggest news gathering organization in the UK and probably the biggest in the world, or in competition to be. And interestingly, all the folks at the dinner said, oh yes, but that's anomalous. We couldn't even have a conversation about the House of Lords today, about the BBC Today, because it's a relic of the socialist past of Britain, and you can't get rid of it, but you would never establish it. In a sense, it's an extreme case, although it's an honorable extreme case, and I often present this to audiences of American journalists just as a sort of puzzle and say, what if you could levy a tax and create a totally protected news organization that actually did a great job? And they always say, they recoil, and they say, no, you could never do that because it would be a violation of the First Amendment. So let's start with this. Is some sort of direct state support of journalism a good idea?
Well, what do you mean by state support?
Do you want me to jump in and get you out of this?
No, not at all.
Let me say what I mean by state support. I mean, you can have everything from completely state-dominated media like Pravda in the good old days, or you can have a sort of protected space such as you enjoy, but nonetheless, there's a very strong, at least, financing mechanism to the state. Or you can have nonprofits with, in the U.S., which have a tax advantage and implied subsidy, or you can have a structure like National Public Radio in the United States. Well, is this something we should be talking about?
Definitely, in my view. And I mean, the crucial point about the BBC, the advantage we have is a very strong funding base. But it is a complete anachronism. It would never be invented again. But the most crucial thing about it are those firewalls, which are very explicit, set out in the Constitution, are kind of patrolled and fought over almost daily in some ways. But the BBC's independence is absolutely crucial, and without that, we're nothing. Our credibility and our trust and our standards come from being able to protect that independence, and every so often we have a huge row with the British government over some issue or other, which for us is fundamentally about that independence. And therefore, I think when you say state funding, it has to be recognised that it would have to be state funding with that independence embedded in it. And I can't see many governments committing the kind of level of state funding again and giving that complete editorial freedom to an organisation. In that sense, I think the BBC is an anachronism. Now, whether there may be other forms of funding, I don't know. One of the things I've always wondered about the US is, you know, there are many very well endowed foundations and so on who are very concerned about high quality and independent media, and yet there isn't the equivalent of what we have with The Guardian, the Scott Trust, for example, which is an endowment which gives a newspaper some freedom to have, has a particular political position in The Guardian's case, but nevertheless to support high quality journalism. That is a different model, and I do think there is an issue that actually the market alone, there are one or two honourable exceptions, is not going to protect high quality serious journalism of the kind that we need in order to have the kind of global public debate that we're clearly going to have in this very complicated world we're entering.
So just to press you a little, if somebody came to you and said, now, what if we just cut the umbilical cord and abolish the licensing fee and have you operate on the American model, I assume you would not say, great, that's what I've always wanted my whole life.
Oh, but no, I certainly wouldn't. Some of my colleagues might enjoy it, but I certainly wouldn't want that. I mean, I think if that happened, the BBC could be a very successful commercial broadcaster, but the nature of its programming would change completely. We would be producing programming to drive ratings to serve advertisers, and our choices about commissioning and programming would be made on a completely different basis. So we'd be a very completely different organisation.
Mike, the New York Times has been in an interesting position here. There's a fund manager at Morgan Stanley who's sort of gone hammer and tongs after the company and said, you are not producing enough profits for my tastes. And the New York Times has an AB stock structure that allows the owning family, the Sulzbergers, to control it. That has made the public stockholders, or at least the big ones, quite unhappy. It's certainly not what we would call a growth stock, as you may have occasion to reflect when you look at your retirement plan. We've seen in the
Have I talked to you about my fee today, by the way?
We've seen in the United States a lot of churn over these issues. The Wall Street Journal has just changed hands out of the sort of benign paternalistic family ownership of the Bancrofts to Rupert Murdoch. Knight Ridder is no longer with us. And there's a general sense, and you know, according to rumor, although he's never said it to me, your publisher likes to talk about the moose in the room as an image. The moose in the room is the big obvious thing nobody wants to talk about. Former Times reporter, now hedge fund manager and friend of your publisher, Steve Ratner, wrote a very provocative and interesting op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal a while back, and he came and talked at our school about it, in which he said, look, the moose in the room, he didn't use that image, is that great newspapers are just not a viable economic model in the marketplace, and we need to think of another support system for them, which took a lot of guts for him to say. What do you think of that proposition?
Here's the way I describe the moose in the room. The changing nature of the world, which is most importantly the changing technological nature of the world, is having two huge effects on journalism. The first one is the audience challenge it's creating for us. What's our relationship to the audience? It's what Richard was talking about before about gatekeeping. And the other, very related but profoundly separate, is the business model challenge. The internet is essentially disassembling the 100-year-old business model that sustained great journalism, not just in the United States, but in a number of places, but particularly in the United States, where journalists would create great journalism. They would put it in their publication or put it on their television network. They would distribute it to a large audience. Advertisers would pay large amounts of money to reach that audience. Publishers and broadcasters made a great deal of money, and journalists made a decent enough living doing that. Well, that virtuous circle, some people might have thought it was vicious, that virtuous circle is collapsing. It's really breaking down, and I think that's what Steve Ratner is talking about when he talks about the business model. It's a little bit of a strange conversation because, in fact, the New York Times and many other big newspapers are still highly profitable companies with substantial profit margins that in most other industries would be the envy of the world. What this business crisis is about, particularly my paltry stock holdings in my retirement plan, is about the way the market values you, which is to say it values what it believes your future to be. If you look at the New York Times right now, it's making a lot of money, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The problem is that people don't perceive a future. I think that's wrong. I think that journalism has a fabulous future, and it's because we're going to find the answer to the issue that Richard posed, which is we're going to reinvent ourselves not as gatekeepers, but we're going to find another image, but it will be some kind of combination of color commentator and guide through the strange world of the 21st century. And we will learn a new role for ourselves that will be equally profoundly important. And on that role, we will build new business models on the internet and in other ways that I think will create equally successful businesses. But right now, it's a pretty painful and confusing period. And it's painful if you're on the business side of media companies, and it's pretty scary if you're on the journalistic side.
Can I just pick up on that, Nick? I mean, I absolutely agree with what Mike said there. But I think the interesting thing, coming back to what you were asking me before, is in broadcasting on the international front, we have this huge explosion of competition, but none of it's profitable. So France 24 is part publicly funded. Russia Today is funded by the Kremlin. Al Jazeera is funded by the Emir of Qatar. You know, I could go on. All of the new entrants on the global front, none of them are profitable. And actually, I'm sure all of them would say they have some form of editorial independence, though from the tape you may well want to question that. So I absolutely agree with Mike. We're busy now reinventing journalism, both in print and in the internet and in broadcast. What worries me, I suppose, is that on global journalism is whether there is something emerging which is going to kind of guarantee impartiality and objectivity and those principles that you know, the Columbia believes in, the BBC believes in, and so on as well. Is there a business model that can guarantee that? And that's the worry for me.
Right. And the other worry, I agree completely with that, and the other worry is that we as journalists, under all this pressure, may forget what it was we actually know how to do. There is a craft called journalism, and and it's an extremely important craft. It's the ability, there's a famous American philosopher of 100 years ago who used to say that an editor's job was to separate the wheat from the chaff and print the chaff. And by and large, I think he had it right. I mean, our job is to sort and to figure things out. You know, the great German publisher Matthias Dapfner, who's been a real visionary on some of these issues, talks about how what audiences need now more than ever is orientation in the world. And that's what we know how to do. And we need to keep remembering that that's what we know how to do. We need to find new ways to do it. We can't be gatekeepers anymore. We can't be the authoritarian voice speaking from the mount. But we can't lose sight of the skill we have and the way we know how to do it, because that is of more value today than it's ever been. And we'll figure out ways to derive business value out of that. And the worst thing we could do is let go of that in the course of trying to adapt to these new worlds. So I think the danger of not having a business model, the danger of new kinds of ownership that undercut our independence, and the danger that we ourselves will lose our souls, in effect, by trying to adapt in ways that are actually to give up journalism, all scare me, frankly.
Talk about the situation with regard to all these issues in Turkey, if you would, and culturally and structurally, if you have a continuum between pure market, pure state control with many stops in between, where are you? And what do you think is the ideal? Is that where you are or somewhere else?
I think we're talking about power here, and then we're talking about integrity and journalism, because journalism and owning news media brings amazing amounts of power. So this, to some, this could be the cause for starting unprofitable ventures or continuing with them. In Turkey, we have the state tradition, especially on the TV side, and I would say that on the whole, even though it's underfunded compared to other channels, that they have kept a certain integrity in their journalism. But I would say for the most part, the Turkish media scene is now a pretty private venture, dominated by one very strong group and several other strong groups. So I would say that in Turkey, more and more so, unfortunately, the consumer of the news, the population, sees news. When they see a certain piece of news, when they see a headline, they will not say, oh, this is what happened. They will say, why did they put this specific headline? There must be a reason why this newspaper is talking about this in this light, as opposed to something else, which could be the news. So it's kind of, I think, really sad for the profession of journalism, for the integrity of journalism, that the audience, when they read a comment, instead of thinking about the comment, immediately thinks about the rationale for this comment. So I would say there's a mistrust of news channels.
So let's spend the last few minutes before we go to questions trying to, we've presented a problem essentially, and let's see how far we can get toward talking about solutions to the problem. First, let me put out a view that there is no problem. I often think the term that describes the state of journalism, at least in the U.S., is back to the future. If you go, one of the great things about being at a university is your perspective broadens immediately. So the horrible truth is I knew absolutely nothing about the history of my own profession until I became a dean and I had to start planning courses in it. What I now know is that if you went back through most of the 19th century, most of American journalism was a cacophony of partisan voices. When the founders wrote the First Amendment, if you correct me if I'm wrong here, they did not really have in mind what we've just been talking about and what Mike just very eloquently stated as the ideal. They had in mind the Tom Paines of the world who were putting out pamphlets and they should be protected. So what if I were to say there is no problem? The core function of the press is simply as a platform for the strong and unfettered statement of opinion and perspective, and with global satellite broadcasting, with the internet and so on, we're in the golden age of journalism. Why isn't that true?
Can I start off? I mean, I think it's, in one sense, of course, it is true, and when you look at the blogs, of course, there are many parallels with the pamphleteers of the 19th century and earlier than that. But I think journalism has developed, and we've learned things about journalism over the past 200 years, and not least with what Joseph Pulitzer did with Columbia, and the idea of impartiality and the idea of what that can do to public debate and public discourse, I think is very important. And therefore we're going through this huge disruption driven largely by technology, although also by, as the President was saying, kind of economic integration around the world and so on as well. Huge disruption at the minute, and we shouldn't lose the baby with the bathwater. So what we're trying to do is to hang on to what we've learned and what we've developed and what's been good through that as we go through this huge disruption. It'd be very easy to cast it away, and there's a lot of debate and a lot of print wasted, in my view, saying, well, impartiality is dead, it never really existed, let's just have this great, feast of opinion everywhere, and that's fine, isn't it? People can just choose what they want. I don't think that is fine. We can have a philosophical discussion about whether there's any such thing as impartiality, but even if you don't believe in it, the attempt to achieve it improves quality, raises standards, and helps reinforce and support a high-quality public debate, which is very important. So for me, I think the important thing is as we go through this huge technology disruption, as we try and reinvent the future of journalism, we need to hang on to what we've learned and what's been good and important about that.
Let me just press you just one more tweak on this, which is to raise the point Pointy Peck made. This is a very widely made point about everybody who's at a university, and that is, and one could say the making of this point originates in this great city, is anyone who claims to be an information purveyor or knowledge purveyor is not to be trusted, because what they claim is information is actually just a sort of gussied up version of their power position in the world. What makes you so sure you're not merely engaging in that?
Well, there'll be plenty of people who'll say we are. Believe me, you should see my email inbox. That's, absolutely. But one of the great positive things I think that's coming through the change we're living through at the minute is the transparency and accountability that follows from a lot of what the internet can offer. And all news organisations, absolutely including the BBC, but many others as well, are going through quite a painful process of cultural change. I mean, let's be honest, news organisations and journalists have not been the most accountable or the most transparent business or profession in the past. But I think we're going to have to be in the future, and we're learning that and understanding that and being held to account, and that's why you get crises at CBS and yes at the BBC and the New York Times and so on as well. But actually we do have the ability to be truly transparent and accountable, and that will raise standards and protect standards in the future.
When Tom Paine got off that boat from England with nothing in his pocket except a letter from Ben Franklin, and he walked into Philadelphia, literally, well, actually almost had to be carried in because he was so sick, but entered Philadelphia, and he was hired by a local publisher in Philadelphia, and in the book I've just written on the U.S. Constitution's political role, I describe that as the most important hire of a freelance writer in American history. And I'm a huge fan of advocacy writing, opinion writing. I think it has always had an important place, and in the world of the internet, I think increasingly has an important place. But the more there is that, I think the more important it also is that there are people out there who are trying to portray the world without that agenda, without the agenda of seeking an outcome. And it can never be done perfectly, and it can never be done without some influence of your own preconceptions or biases or power positions or whatever deconstructionist influence we want to apply. But the role that journalism, I agree wholeheartedly with Richard here, the role of journalism as we've created it in the 20th century is a terrific invention. And it would be a real shame if, as a result of all of these dramatic changes, we lose that. It's not an either or. You can have both. You should have both. You can't help but have both. It's not a choice, but you want to preserve both.
So let me just push as my last thing before going to audience questions, and I'll start with you, Peck, and this is putting you on the spot, of course. What if we all agree that this particular aspect of journalism, which of course isn't an either or anymore in the age of the internet with the Tom Paine aspect, is somewhat endangered for a combination of economic, structural, political, cultural reasons, and deserves shoring up, what would work to shore it up? Would it be laws passed? Would it be some purely economic solution? Would it be a kind of organization of the profession and professional education? What are the promising avenues to really strengthen this aspect of journalism that I think we all think is a little shaky right now?
I don't really believe in regulation on this topic, but I believe in professional responsibility. I think that it depends on the institution or the institutions globally or within a nation to take the necessary steps. But then, for example, the debate we have in Turkey on this, I often have with newspaper editors is, why do you do your front page like this, whereby, in my opinion, some of the news mentioned really should not be on the first page, and they will claim that the audience wants it this way. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation, whereby some people will claim the reader of the news, the observer of the news, is demanding news to be presented in a certain way, and some people will say, no, it's your responsibility to show the integrity and the whole cohesiveness of the issue to the audience. So in my opinion, it's a professional responsibility and ethics issue.
Mike?
It's all about the audience. The audience is us. It's that relationship that makes us everything we are. And first of all, I think we have to believe in that. We have to believe that if we stick to what we are good at and know how to do and stick to our professional standards and responsibilities and don't get rattled by all the things going on around us, we will build big, strong, loyal audiences for the kind of journalism we all believe in. And then we will figure out, over time, how to build businesses that support what we do. I'm not a knee-jerk opponent of government subsidies in some cases too. That can be part of it. I think particularly if that's one of a variety of models, it can work okay. But the most important issue here is not the business model, it's the relationship to the audience, because everything else can be built on that.
Richard?
Well, two things really. I mean, we do get the media we deserve to the extent that, the tabloids in Britain are the biggest selling newspapers. A lot more people buy the Sun than buy the Financial Times. So yes, they do get the media they deserve in that sense. But I do believe that, particularly with the internet, you can build a strong business around serious journalism, and there will be a model that emerges. The other thing I'd just briefly say is, particularly in the BBC, which is, as you said earlier, is basically a big state intervention within Britain into the media and into journalism, we're often accused of market distortion by our commercial competitors. And my response to that is that actually journalism left entirely to Rupert Murdoch and to one or two other big aggressive commercial organisations is actually an information distortion. And there is another side to the equation that people need to take into account as well.
Okay, I'll just add a couple things before we go to questions. First of all, thank you. Whenever you come back to the podium, you know, back when he was dealing with really controversial issues, Lee used to write about regulation of broadcasting. His position, if I can summarize a career in one sentence, was broadcast regulation is a good thing, print regulation is a bad thing. Is that fair? I'm curious whether you still think that. So, especially now that in the U.S. broadcast regulation has sort of gone away, or has deteriorated a lot since you were defending it. Is that a good thing? And or on the other side of the equation, should there be more state intervention in print journalism, something that journalists recoil from in horror? So hold that thought. You know, just to close this part of the panel, it's really interesting for me as a lifelong journalist to be thinking about this in the context of being at a university for these last few years. In a certain way, we're atypical denizens of a great university, because I suspect that when this day is done, you will have heard more from us of, you know, up close and personal concern about things like sort of our connection to big popular audiences, market forces, and so on, and even government intervention, than you will from people from elsewhere in the university who engage in the endeavors they engage in. So the good and bad of our job is we're out on the front lines of politics and the marketplace and so on, more than most people in a university. On the other hand, the research university, at least in the United States, was invented right around the same time as the kind of journalism, informational, objective, non-perspectival, that ideal in journalism was invented at just about the same time, late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And that isn't coincidental, and Joseph Pulitzer had the idea of locating a great school of journalism in a great university at this same time. His crusade to start our school lasted from the early 1890s into the beginning of the 20th century, and then the school opened in 1912. Everybody here is wrestling with some of the same problems, versions of the notion that a research university began in a moment of total confidence about expertise and authority, and has spent much of the last, you know, quarter century and more being really challenged on that notion of itself. Is there such a thing as disinterested scholarship? Is there such a thing as expertise? Should the state, the public, look to the kind of folks who sit in universities, who are, you know, hold themselves up often as disinterested purveyors of information, as figures to respect? Conversely, should we, as people in universities, really try internally to hew to the idea that we're completely neutral and informational, or are we allowed to be political actors, and if so, when? These are questions that can keep you up at night, but it's fun to be in a location where they're just being addressed by everybody. They're the most vital questions of our time, and it's very enriching as a journalist to know that we're not the only ones who have these problems, and to kind of cross-pollinate with other people who have their very different versions of these problems and try to come up with answers. From where we sit, the best thing we can do at our school, I think, is one piece of the puzzle, which is try to create a very strong sense of professional standards. This doesn't mean, and it would be impossible in the age of the web, trying to keep people out of being journalists, but it does mean trying to maintain both skills and habits of thinking and notions of professional conduct that would enable us to function in the role of information providers in a way that can really be trusted, and that I would hope and dream can transcend the kinds of local and national perspectives that we saw at the beginning of this piece. So that's what we're trying to do, and whether we'll succeed remains to be seen, but it's fun to have that as your job description. I will start reading questions, depending on how good the handwriting is. Okay. With newspapers closing their foreign bureaus and getting international news from the wires, what is the impact on the quality of reporting when there are fewer journalists on the ground? This is a signed question from a Columbia Journalism School grad, but I think I said at the outset I wasn't going to announce the names, so I'll spare you. But who would like to take that on?
Well, first of all, it's obviously, I assume, written from a kind of American point of view. The foreign bureaus I assume we're talking about here are the outposts outside the United States of American news organizations. And it's a worrisome process, mainly for the reason that we discussed at the very beginning, because in order to have a broader view of the world, in order to punch holes in your own paradigms, you've got to be hearing from people outside, and if you've brought them all home, you're going to have a lot more trouble hearing. There are several really excellent wire services, and they do a very good job, and on many stories their work is not just adequate, but excellent, and every newspaper everywhere on earth relies on them some of the time. But the retreat from international coverage by American news organizations is a worrisome phenomenon.
The really tough part of that question, at least in terms of the conversations I have, is if you're the Dallas Morning News and you say, why do I have to have a Paris bureau or a London bureau? My readers don't care very much. Other news organizations have them. It's replicative. What is the public good that's served by my maintaining that bureau? And you can make the argument that the more replication of function there is, the healthier it is. I mean, the obvious place for Americans would be in Washington. You want to have a whole bunch of people sitting there, and Bush's press conference is not just one person, but it's very hard for people to make those economic decisions to maintain an expensive bureau that doesn't seem on mission for a local newspaper.
Yeah, and that's a completely reasonable discussion. If you're a Dallas newspaper, your most important quote-unquote foreign bureau is obviously Mexico City. Right. And you have to make choices, obviously, and different parts of the country have different relationships to the rest of the world. But if everybody retreats, we're really losing something.
Next question. Traditionally, leading mainstream media have counted on their brand as their advantage in the fragmented world of new media. But YouTube has built a brand in 3 years. Al Jazeera built a brand in 5 years. Are the MSM, for the uninitiated, that means mainstream media, deluding themselves on how they'll compete in the future?
I think that we live in a very, very fast world with the internet and the emission of news from all different channels. But I think over time, things find their own niche. Like YouTube is a niche. It's true that even in Turkey, a lot of people are relying on YouTube to get the news that for this reason or that reason is not shown in the regular media. So I think that traditional mainstream news media will continue to have a large impact on the big picture, but there will be niche organizations that are either reactive, like Al Jazeera, I believe, is kind of an antidote to maybe CNN or Fox News. So the reactive, the people who are reacting to the way large media organizations are presenting the news are forming other blocks, or there are niche opportunities presented by the internet, like YouTube. So these are interesting points that some of the main players may get into in the future, but they will also carve little parts out of the mainstream media, in my opinion.
I think, oh please, Richard.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up. I don't think the mainstream media is kidding itself or complacent. I see the opposite. I see the mainstream media terrified by what's happening. I mean, we did a survey a year or so ago that showed globally the fourth most highly valued and respected news brand in the world was Google, and at that time Google produced no journalism at all. All it did was aggregate everybody else's. So that is pretty terrifying. If you are investing, hundreds of millions of pounds in editorial resources, and someone with an algorithm is stealing your your place in the world. But you know, the truth is we are going to go through a shakedown, and some big brands are going to disappear, and there are going to be some new brands that come in. And if you work for the BBC or the New York Times or NBC, you know, we spend all our time working out how do we reinforce our position, what is our new role, how do we provide value to our audience in a way that they're going to, you know, really want and continue that relationship with you. And that's what the job of those of us running news organizations is at the minute. It's that strategic role.
A quality brand, a good name, is a statement of what the audience thinks about what you've been. And in this world, that lasts exactly a minute, and then it's what you're going to be that matters. And if you do believe that you can rest just on your brand, then you truly are deluded. The good news is, if you're deluded like that, you'll be gone pretty fast, and we won't have to talk about you anymore.
I have to say, you know, Al Jazeera, has been pointed out, has a state system of support. YouTube is, in terms of all these market questions, a very sobering example. As some of you may have heard, deans have to fundraise a little bit, and so I, at one point, went to see a former reporter for Time magazine who is now a Silicon Valley venture capitalist and funded YouTube. And he told me that at the time it was sold to Google for how many billions of dollars? They didn't even have an office. They had a staff of 3. And they were working in a spare conference room at this particular venture capital company. And this man said to me with great pleasure, "That's the economic future of journalism." So that's why I personally don't feel it's an automatic thing that the market will support large reporting staffs necessarily. It's a real challenge.
That's why we've all been nice to you today, in case we need a teaching job.
Please speak to the effect of new problems with safety of journalists, especially killing of Japanese photojournalist in Burma, which is just very recent, but there have been many others. Somebody?
Yeah, earlier this year I am on the board of an organisation called the International News Safety Institute, and we produced a report which looked back over the killing of journalists over the last 10 years. And there are 2 things about that. An average of 2 journalists have been killed doing their work every week in, week out for the last 10 years, but that the trend is getting worse. I think last year it was about 160 journalists were killed doing their job. This year I think it looks like it's going to be worse still. So the trend is up. There are a number of issues lying behind that. Part of it is the loss of neutrality. Actually, journalists are no longer recognized as being neutral players. They're simply associated with the country they come from. They're therefore more likely to be targets. It's the nature of conflict these days, and you have to look at Iraq and other places in the Middle East to see how risky it is. And all news organizations are having to invest very heavily in the training and safety of their staff. To maintain a team in Baghdad costs us tens of millions of pounds every year. And that is a real challenge. So there isn't a very positive message I can put out of this, except to say it's a real issue, it's getting more difficult, and it's very expensive. And one of the things we're trying to do is to get recognition for those states that don't pursue those who murder journalists doing their job. And there is a problem of impunity and a culture of impunity in many countries. And if at least we could get international pressure to say, you know, impunity for killing journalists is not acceptable, it would be a first start.
Ipek, this is a question directed at you, so I'll just give it to you, and you can read it out loud.
Do women report or tell stories differently? Is it harder to be a woman in the newsroom? Tough one. I mean, I think there's the general stereotype that I sometimes have heard in newsrooms that women like to look at the emotional side or the history of a topic more than the man. But I think for the most part it really doesn't matter. And women tend to have maybe more interest in some issues because they face them, like issues relating to women's empowerment or issues relating to women's rights, especially in societies like Turkey or in other emerging markets. They're more sensitive to these issues, perhaps. But I see for the most part really not a huge difference between the way we handle the news. But this is up to the audience to decide.
Following the cartoon crisis in February 2006, where satiric drawings of Muhammad published in a Danish newspaper caused violent outrage throughout the Islamic world, Islamic organizations demanded, quote, limitations, unquote, and a new set of ethics. Please comment on the advantage, disadvantage of such limitations on freedom of speech.
Okay, let me start. I mean, I think this is a really complicated area and very challenging for those, particularly in international journalism as we are. My starting point would be to say that we do have responsibilities in terms of other cultures, and that freedom of speech is not the same as free and easy speech. It doesn't mean that anything goes. So in terms of the cartoons row, for example, it was obviously a very reportable issue. Within the BBC, we were pretty careful not to show all of the cartoons, but we did communicate what they showed and why they were offensive. In other words, we tried to draw a line that meant we were as open with all of our audiences about what these cartoons were and what they showed, but we also showed some restraint in seeking not to pour petrol on the fire or to offend any of our Muslim audience. And I think there are responsibilities there, and you know, this is already very complicated. It may get more complicated as you go on. But I would say that I think people who try to say freedom of speech means anything goes are wrong. We have responsibilities that have to go alongside that.
And one of the factors that goes into how you manage this kind of a question is having the resources in your own newsroom, the diverse resources as we were discussing earlier, so that you have people who can help make a judgment. Most newspapers in the modern world would not countenance running an anti-Semitic cartoon. So therefore you have to have people who can make the distinction between a politically powerful cartoon about some issue affecting the Islamic world, which would be legitimate to publish, and an anti-Muslim cartoon. And that means you have to have people who understand those issues. So
I'd like to comment on this. This was a very, very hot topic in Turkey, and it was widely argued. And basically, I think it's important, once the cartoons were out, the handling of the cartoons by the newspaper and by the Danish authorities, I think is as important in its delicacy and in taking into issue all the different varieties of reactions, as the fact that it was a mistake perhaps that they were there in the first place, but it could have been handled better, in which case maybe the crisis could have been more contained or more palatable to Muslims.
I should also say this issue has come up a little for us at the school because the editor who ran the cartoons, Fleming Rose, has been sort of hiding out in New York, somewhat in plain sight in the Salman Rushdie manner. And he's been in our school a lot, and he comes to visit, he speaks to classes, and so on, which I think is very interesting for our students, but we have not put him up on a stage and had a big announced public event, which may or may not be the right call. I just sort of mentioned that these issues are constantly presenting themselves, and there's obviously security concerns, et cetera, with that.
There's one other aspect to that row, which is, of course, to some extent it was staged. I mean, the BBC reported those cartoons the previous October, and nobody noticed or cared or was watching. But it was that particular moment, and indeed they've been published in Egyptian newspapers, I think. So there was a particular group of mullahs or whatever who wanted to make an issue of it and decided to make an issue of it, and then it took off and became this kind of global thing. But you know, when you get these issues, you have to look quite carefully at why has it come to public attention at that moment, whose interest is it to have that kind of row at that moment. You know, there's quite a lot of agendas playing in the background to that. It's not always as straightforward as it appears.
I guess this will be the last question because we're right up against the end. How has U.S. journalism changed under Bush?
Who wants to take it?
It's got to be you, Mike.
I'm here. How would I know?